Hey everybody, welcome to Tech for Psych, where we combine the latest neurotechnology with the ancient wisdom to supercharge your brain. Today we're talking to Glenn Doniger, the scientific director of MindLift, who's going to take us step by step through MindLift's new assessment tool. This is an amazing tool. I've used it already on myself just to test it out. It's really interesting. It has a ton of great data that I can't wait to use with my clients. It's really amazing that MindLift is able to take the Muse headband and allow you to move the auxiliary electrode to different areas of the brain to collect data and compare it to population statistics to create a Z-score that is close to classic quantitative EEG that you can do at home. These used to be a method that was only be able to be done at brick and mortar practices that would be very expensive, and the fact that MindLift is developing a tool so that you can get statistical comparisons of a person's brainwaves compared to the general population in the form of a quasi-quantitative EEG measure that can be done at home is amazing. It's democratizing this technology, and it's going to really help out everybody that's doing really good neurofeedback work. In addition, MindLift is working on a brain mapping tool that should be very visually engaging for both clients and their providers to work and talk about different areas of the brain, different EEG measures, and different effects of neurofeedback. So let's tune into Glenn here, who's going to take us through and give us a lot of juicy details in this interview about the MindLift assessment tool that I think you'll find very interesting.
All right, it's Dr. Cody Rell with Tech for Psych. I've got Glenn Doniger with me from MindLift. Thanks so much for joining, Glenn.
My pleasure. Thanks, Cody.
And the reason we started this conversation was MindLift is coming out with this new application, this new feature that I'm really excited about, because I know that working one-on-one with clients, it would be such an amazing tool to use. And it is an assessment tool, and I was hoping you'd be able to tell us a little bit about it. One of the things I wanted to start off the conversation with is that, I've noticed since in talking with MindLift that you guys are continually evolving and really improving your efforts. And I was curious what the motivating factor behind this assessment tool was.
Sure. Well, the main motivation behind the assessment tool is to integrate within the MindLift platform objective, behavioral, and neural metrics of brain health. And this complements our neurofeedback training functionality. And like the training, clients can perform the assessment from the comfort of their own home. And in addition, we have a symptom tracker that provides subjective information that can be tracked over time. That complements the objective information that the assessment will offer. The assessment tool also allows clinicians and clients to monitor change over time and to personalize the training protocol in a way that they weren't able to do before. It's all in-house within the MindLift system. And thirdly, it allows the clients to understand better, how their brain is doing and which frequencies, if you will, need work and so on. That puts them a lot more in touch with what they're actually doing during the training. And that's a theme that runs throughout MindLift. We recently released a feature whereby during the training, the client can see circles, if you will, that kind of move around. And when they're all aligned, that's an indication that the frequencies are in the right zone. So we want to engage the client. We want to have the client understand as best he can or she can exactly what they need to work on. And we think that will improve the efficacy of the training. So all of that are the thoughts behind the assessment.
Yeah, we were talking a week or two ago about quantitative EEG, and that, I've had that done to me in going into brick and mortar clinics. And you had mentioned this is not quite full-on quantitative EEG, but it seems to be a step in the right direction. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So part of this assessment is a reference database, which may sound familiar to those of you who are familiar with QEEG. And eventually, we aim to provide the same type of comparison as you would have with QEEG, but it will be our own reference database. And this assessment tool is in beta release right now, partly because we want to collect additional data for that reference database. And it's a bit different from QEEG in the sense that we've got, at the moment, we've got 9 electrode sites that are available to us, in the current incarnation of the assessment. But we believe that those sites are strategically placed and that they provide sufficient information that, the clinician can glean a sense of, where the patient, the client is strong and where the client is less strong. And that can, so in that sense, it's similar to a QEEG.
Yeah, there's so many interesting metrics that are on the assessment tool already, and I'm really excited to use it with one-on-one clients, like differences between left and right symmetry of the brain, as well as alpha metrics, beta metrics, data metrics. These are all really exciting tools that I think that clinicians can use moving forward with their neurofeedback clients to, like you said, make an assessment before going into the treatment, but also to follow up and see how the treatment's actually done. And, I'm just so impressed on how you and MindLift are able to move forward with breaking new ground. And one of my questions was, how do you explore new territories like this, but maintain scientific integrity as you move forward?
Yeah. So at the development stage, the design of our tools is informed by the most current scientific evidence and the best clinical practices in the field. So we do draw from the existing knowledge base, but we also aim to push the envelope and advance the field by building upon what's been done previously and providing innovative tools to clients and clinicians. So that's number one. And our development cycle is extremely intensive. We check and recheck to make sure that everything works as intended. Number two, though, is the release stage. And the release stage begins with a limited release. In the case of the assessment, we began with a beta release. And that allows us to, tweak things to evaluate how well, our innovative tool is working. And then once we're confident that everything looks good, we can go to the full release. And eventually this is going to be a premium feature, the assessment. At the moment, it's only available for Android. Shortly, it will be available for iOS. So the release was limited in the sense, both in the sense that, it's free. The reference database is rather small at the beginning, and also that it's for only Android and not iOS at the beginning. But gradually we'll come to a full release once we've tested out, all the functionality in terms of the field application, right? Everything works in the office, or in the lab, that's great, but until it actually gets out there in the hands of clients and clinicians and they try it out, we really don't know for sure, if it's gonna hold up. So that's the approach. Is to ground our new technologies in firm evidence-based science, but at the same time to take that leap forward and design things that are innovative, and then check ourselves and see how those innovations perform, particularly in real-world settings.
Yeah, I know I've enjoyed using it on myself so far, so we'll see what the data brings. Would you mind showing us some of the features?
Sure. All right. So I can go ahead and share my screen. So from the MindLift dashboard then, you'd click on Clients, you bring up your client, and there's this tab called Assessments, and it says Beta next to it. You click on that to set up an assessment for your client. Now, we have a very useful article that you can access by clicking on this link here, Learn More Here. It brings up, sort of how-to for the assessments. I recommend that everybody who's using the assessment feature begin by reviewing this article. And this just gives an overview of what the assessment's all about. It's about 20 to 30 minutes in total. We talked about why the assessment is useful. And then we've got different parts of the assessment. We have EEG metrics, and we have a CPT. We have a continuous performance task that is a behavioral test of attention and executive function. So as I said before, the assessment gives us objective measures of behavior as well as objective measures of neural activity, if you will. And this is what the interface looks like on the app. Essentially, when you start the assessment, you begin with a particular brain region, and then you place the electrode in the appropriate location for that brain region. There are 5 electrodes or 5 brain regions that are recorded in the course of the assessment, and each one of those recordings is about 2 or 3 minutes in length. Sometimes the eyes will be open, sometimes they'll be closed, and in one case there's a task that we have the client do. It's counting backwards by 7s. Now, when the assessment is over, pretty much right away, the results are available. And you can see graphs and scores that summarize performance both on the brain measures and on the behavioral measures. And soon we're going to be adding brain maps, and I'll talk about that a little later. So this is the article. Just close that for now, and we'll set up the assessment. In this case, my client, this is not a real client, had indicated that he's doing neurofeedback because he has symptoms of anxiety and sleep difficulties. So those tags that were selected previously for the client appear again here, and you have an opportunity to adjust them if necessary. And then click on next, and then we verify the gender and the date of birth. Those are particularly important because they can influence how we standardize the scores. Okay. And then this is very important. The clinician would need to decide when the assessments should be administered, or when they should be done by the client. Immediately before the next training session, or it can be or every some number of minutes of training. So the idea is that the first assessment is usually going to be before training begins. That serves as a baseline. And then the clinician can decide to repeat the assessment every X number of minutes of training. So we can set this, say, to 100 minutes of training. And there's also the option to choose either the full assessment, which includes all the elements that I described a couple minutes ago, or you can customize the assessment and say only administer the CPT, that's the continuous performance task, or choose particular brain regions that are of interest and only include those in the assessment. We're going to do the full assessment now and save it. Okay, so now the assessment is turned on, and it's scheduled to occur immediately before the next session and every 100 minutes of training. Okay, so that looks great. So at this point, the client, in the comfort of his home, would access the MindLift app. I'm going to go ahead and try that on this Android device. Okay, so here's the MindLift app, and I'm going to go ahead and sign in to that MindLift app. This is John Doe, not a real client, right? So this should be familiar to you. And we're going to skip the orientation. And now it tells me that I've got an assessment, whoops, this way. Now it tells me that I've got an assessment waiting for me. So you can see that the assessment that the clinician configured in the dashboard is now available to the client, just the same way that when the clinician configures training for the client, it appears in the app, okay? And then you can click on Start Assessment, and it tells you the purpose of the assessment, there, and so on. I'm going to skip through to the post-assessment stage now.
Yes, please.
And take a look at the results. Okay, so for that purpose, we're going to look at a different client, also not a real client. Just pull it up. Okay, I'll just do it this way. Okay, so we're going to try this one. Every account on the Mindlift system actually has a sample client with assessment data so that you can take a look at this and see what the results look like even before you run an assessment on a real client. So you can look in your account for something that says sample something, and that's probably your demo client. So I'm going to go ahead and click on assessments again. And now I see that this particular client has 2 assessments that have been completed. The one here at the bottom and in a new tab, oh, great, ignore that. Okay, in a new tab, you've got the all the scores that I alluded to before. So I'll take you through the scores now. Okay. At the top, you've got a radar graph that gives you a profile of brain health and includes summary scores from the CPT, the continuous performance task. Those are the focus index and the timing index. And then it includes summary scores for the EEG metrics. So we've got alpha, beta, left-right symmetry, and theta. Those are the things that, Cody, that you mentioned earlier on. You can put your cursor over a particular score or a particular point on the profile to see the value. And you can see that if they're doing, kind of perfectly, then this purple blob will extend to the edges of the radar graph, right? So alpha is 100%, beta is 100%. And these guys, like left-right symmetry, theta, and focus index are a bit lower, around 88, 87, 88%. And the timing index from the CPT is down at 54%. Okay, so that just gives you the overall picture. But now we can drill down and look at the individual parts of the assessment. So beginning with the CPT, the continuous performance task. In the task performance section of the page, you first have an overall score just for the CPT. In this case, it's indicating about 60% out of 100%. And then in the bottom part, you've got a table with all of the different kinds of scores that we measure for the CPT. We've got the accuracy, which is the percent trials with correct responses, commission errors, number of trials with no response expected, but a response made nonetheless, and that's a measure of hyperactivity or impulsivity. Omission errors, number of trials with a response expected, but no response made, that's a measure of inattention. Response time or reaction time for the correct responses, measure of overall speed, and reaction time variability for the correct responses, which is a measure of consistency. Now, I'll take a step back and tell you a little more about this task because you may not be familiar with it. Generally speaking, the task involves flashes of a particular visual stimulus on the screen. In this case, it's something that looks like an arrow. It's like a colorful arrow. And when that arrow is pointing up, the task is to respond, to touch the screen on the app as rapidly as possible. But when that arrow is not pointing up and is instead pointing a different direction, the task is not to respond, to inhibit the response. So when we talk about commission errors and omission errors, we're talking about, commission errors is when you touch the screen when the arrow was not pointing up, and omission errors is when you failed to touch the screen when the arrow was pointing up. Okay, so that just gives you a better sense of what the task is. Now, there are 2 different types of scores that we have for each of those. One is the raw scores, and the scales are different depending upon the type score. So accuracy is scored on a percent correct scale. That's pretty straightforward. So 100% correct would be perfect. Commission errors and omission errors are simply a count of the number of errors. Reaction time is the average speed, response speed, if you will, for the correct responses in milliseconds. And the reaction time variability is how consistent was that reaction time across the correct responses. Okay, now the raw scores are interesting and they can tell you something, particularly if you have multiple assessments. You can compare baseline to, to the next assessment. But looking at a single assessment, you really can't tell what these mean unless you have standardized scores. So in the next row, we have standardized scores that correspond to those raw scores. And these make use of our reference database. And this is the database that I mentioned is going to grow over time. And by the time we do a full release or a premium release, we'll be confident that this database is large enough and representative enough. But for now, in the beta release, it's whatever we've got. So it's relatively small at this time, but it's constantly growing because a lot of people like you are using this. So that's good. In any case, what we've got here are two different things. First, we've got a classification, categorization, and that's based on the percentile of the score. And then we've got a z-score in the parentheses beneath that. Okay. So in this case, we can see that accuracy was in the very superior range. The percentile was very high. Omission errors was pretty good. It was high. Commission errors and reaction time variability were medium. And reaction time was low. And that's actually consistent with what we saw above. The timing index here in the radar graph was relatively low. So that's consistent. And then in the z-scores, we have the corresponding values. So you can see that, for example, the reaction time has a z-score of minus 3.6. That's more than 3.5 standard deviations below the mean in the reference database. So yeah, so that's the behavioral data that you get. Now we'll move on to the brain data. We'll start with the alpha performance metrics. So you can open up the metrics by clicking on the arrow there. And you can see that we've got a bunch of metrics. For each of the metrics, we have, in the question mark, it's really just a formula that we use to compute the metric. EC is eyes closed, EO is eyes open. So in this first one here, we're looking at alpha response. We're looking at how the alpha changed when the eyes were closed as compared to when they were open. Pretty straightforward. And based upon the literature and our data, we have a certain cutoff that we set over here at 50%. So we're posterior, we're at 0.1, and normally posterior alpha increases by 50% or more when you close your eyes. So that's the green zone over here on the right. And if it's underneath below the 50%, well, then it's possible that stress may be impacting your alpha response. And you can see where the client scored by the location of the brain icon over here. You can see the exact value to the left of the graph. So it's the same format for all of these. I'm not going to run through them all, but that's the idea. And we have, you can see we have various brain regions represented. I mentioned before that there were the 5 sites. So you can see that we've got posterior, central, in this case, and frontal down here. And the choice of which brain regions to include in each set of EEG metrics was again based on the literature and clinical practice. Okay, we can look at beta. Beta's got just these 2. Here's the one that involved the counting, right? So UT here is under task. So we're looking at how does beta change when you're doing a task as compared to when you're not. And in both of those cases, eyes are closed. So Eyes are closed compared to when your eyes are closed and you're counting backwards by sevens at this central site, CZ. So here's your cutoff, here's the performance of the client. And then there's some interpretation down here that you may find helpful. So if they're scoring in the red zone, it may be an indication of tiredness when reading or problem solving. And left-right symmetry makes use of the F3 and F4, and you generally like to see it be about 1. That would indicate that there's good symmetry. So you can see that the green zone for all of these is includes 1 or bounds 1, let's say, 0.85 to 1.15 or 1.25 for these. In this case, this particular metric can be greater than 0.8, and that's considered normal. I should mention that part of the tweaking that we're going to do between the beta release and the final release is potentially to adjust these cutoffs. So these are cutoffs that are based on clinical evidence, and we can certainly use them at the outset, but realize that they may get better, okay, as we collect more data.
And one of the things that we had talked about a little bit before, Glenn, that I was hoping you'd be able to touch on just briefly is, MindLift is providing the data, but it's up to the clinicians to be able to interpret that data for their individual clients.
That's right.
Because there's a lot of discussion about what these scores actually mean in an individual client.
Right. That's right. That's absolutely right. The text that we provide you with is general, but one of the I'm sure you're aware that one of the advantages of neurofeedback is that it can be personalized and maybe should be personalized for the client. And so the clinician shouldn't simply accept whatever is written here in the text as the truth for this patient. It's possible that because of the patient's history and so on, that this may not be relevant or ideal. And particularly when you look at 2 assessments, and you look at change over time, the change can be more important than the interpretation at a single point in time. So this is especially when we're talking about the baseline. The baseline just gives you, where the patient is starting, where the client is starting, and that, may or may not be consistent with the interpretation that we provide you with in the texts. Okay, so yeah, so then theta ratios, theta alpha, theta beta, various locations, various states, that is eyes open, eyes closed, same idea. Sometimes we've got 2 cutoffs, as in this case. This is another one of the counting ones. So normally the ratio here is theta beta while counting eyes closed is 2.2 or less. If it's above 3, well, then that might be associated with impulsivity. But if it's somewhere between 2.2 and 3, well, there may be some cause for concern. So we've got a yellow zone for this particular metric.
Would you be able to comment on why it can be beneficial to compare these different frequencies to theta and what benefit that might bring clinicians?
I mean, these are standard ratios. So theta alpha, which is involved, in ability to relax, is very, is useful in that respect. And theta beta, which we know from ADHD, is very important for remaining on task and being attentive. Those are the theta ratios that we've got represented here. And the directionality, expected directionality of the ratio will depend upon what the application of that ratio is.
Great. So even though someone might have a similar amount of beta to a different person, they might each have different theta levels, so that the ratio would be different. That would be clinically important in certain cases, it sounds like.
Potentially, yes. So those are the metrics, and then down at the bottom of the results, we have the EEG distribution section, which gives the distribution of the EEG amplitudes across the frequency bands per electrode. And the default is relative value. So we're looking at the amplitude for a particular band relative to the total amplitude across all the bands. But you can change that and look at absolute values in microvolts if that's what you prefer. And we've got all the sites, and you can see that the amplitudes decline as the frequency increases, as you'd expect. You also see the peak, if you will, or the jump in amplitude for alpha. And if we look particularly at site 01, where you'd expect to see the largest alpha, you see that big alpha jump in amplitude for eyes closed versus eyes open. And we do have the all the states represented on these graphs, so the eyes open and the eyes closed. And when there was data for under task, that is the counting task, right, the UT, then we show that as well. So this one's interesting because you can see that, here's the eyes closed, right? And then when they're doing the task and their eyes are closed, the alpha drops, right? But it's not quite as low as it is when eyes are open. So you have a nice kind of step function here, stepping down, bring upon the state. So it's really a cool way of visualizing the performance on the assessment. And these graphs and metrics are available not only to the clinician in the dashboard, but also to the client in the app at the conclusion of the assessment. Okay, so that's what it looks like when we look at the results for a single assessment. But let's look at how we would compare two assessments. And that's done with our report generator. So if I click now on reports from the client page, I had previously generated a report for this client, and I can view it now. And on that report, I indicated that I wanted to include the assessment data. So on this report, I've also got some things that are related to the training and the symptoms. This is the symptoms tracker. I'm going to jump over to the assessment. So now this is the same client that we were looking at before, and we were looking at the pre, but we can now see how the performance changed over time. The post, or the second assessment in this case, is superimposed upon the pre, so that the pre is still that purple, that dark purple, but the light purple, or the magenta, I guess, is the post. And where there isn't an overlap in the two, we can see that there's a difference in performance. And of course, most strikingly, what we can see is that the timing index, which had been low the first time around, is now higher, right? So before it was 54, and now it's 91. So it's a pretty sizable change. So that's cool. So you can see the comparison there, and you can also look at the individual scores. This again is for the CPT, for the behavioral task. And you can see that there's been a 20% improvement at post versus pre. And you can look down at the details and for the raw values and the standardized values and see the change pre to post. And if it's a decline, then the change is going to be represented by a red. And if it's an improvement, it's going to be represented by green in the raw and in the standardized values. So if we look at the timing, we can see that indeed there was an improvement in the reaction time. For reaction time, a faster reaction time is better, right? So a lower number. So before it was 455 milliseconds on average, and now it's 390 milliseconds. So that's an improvement of 65 milliseconds. The client is 65 milliseconds faster at post compared to pre. That's what we're seeing represented in the radar graph over here. And same thing with the EEG metrics. We can look at pre and post. This is just the overall score, but we can open it. And we can see for the individual metrics how things changed. The pre value, the post value, the change. We can see two brains now on the graph. So the pre is the brain on top and the post is the brain on the bottom. and we can open up the text as well. Same text that you saw before. So that's the pre-post comparison in terms of the EEG metrics on the report generator. It's going to be the same for these other guys. Okay, and skip this, skip that, and here we have the EEG distribution where we can look at pre and post on the same graph, right? So if I, pick alpha again because it's nice and easy, I can see that I can look at each of the states, the eyes closed, the eyes open, and the under task for pre and post, and see how things change. And you can see that, for example, for eyes closed, the amplitude increased a bit, eyes open dropped a bit, and under task it also increased a bit. Again, this is a sample client, so I wouldn't spend too much time interpreting the data, but it gives you an idea of the type of data, type of results that you can get. And you've got dashed lines and solid lines. The solid line is going to be the post, and the dashed line is going to be the baseline. So you can always compare your post to the baseline by comparing the solid lines to the dashed lines. We've got all the sites here. It's the same data that we saw previously, but now with a comparison between the pre and the post. Yeah, so that's the tour.
That was great. Yeah, it's so amazing to see all the metrics that are going to be available to providers and clients in assessing brain health. And I know you guys have even more on the way, and I was hoping to be able to touch on that briefly. I know you can't show me the finished product yet, but there was talk on the last email or an update that MindLift had sent about brain mapping in the near future.
Yeah. I can show you some screenshots of what that might look like. But as I said, it's a work in progress. So let me just pull that up. There we go. I'll start from the beginning. Okay, this is where we want to start from. And what we will have, hopefully, is an additional section in the results that are available following the assessment. And it will be situated between the EEG metrics and the EEG distribution sections. And it will give scalp distribution maps. We've got the 5 electrode sites, I should say, that were recorded in the assessment, right? And those are CZ, O1, FZ, F3, and F4. Those are all recorded with the auxiliary electrode that connects to the USB port in the Muse. And then in addition to that, we've got the 4 electrode sites in the Muse, AF7, AF8, TP9, and TP10. So we have a total of 9 locations from which we have data. And what we're going to do, hopefully, is take the data that we've got from those 9 locations and generate a brain map, interpolating the voltages between electrodes. And this does look reminiscent of a QEEG. And that's the concept, as we discussed before. If you look at the scale, it's probably familiar to you if you're familiar with brain maps in QEEG, so that relative to the reference database, if the amplitudes are normal or close to average, then the color is going to be green. And if they're lower than normal, they'll be blue. And if they're higher than normal, they'll be red. And the nice thing about this this brain maps feature is that it's going to benefit from the growth of the reference database. It's not going to be a static normative database or reference database, but it is going to grow over time so that the more assessments that are run, the more data we get, hopefully the more representative the reference database will be, and the better these estimates are going to be. So what would happen then is you'd see this among the results, and then you click on the button that says Show Full Brain Map, and that will give you, because here we've got only a representative sampling of frequencies and states, but then you click on the Show Full Brain Map, and you get to see all of the frequency bands for eyes closed and eyes open. Yeah, so it's a bunch. And then you can see the brain maps on the report generator as well. So here we're looking at a report with pre and post brain maps, eyes open and eyes closed. And what you'd like to see, hopefully, is more green on the right, more green for the post as compared to the pre. So I think you kind of see that. Again, this is not a real client, but you do kind of see that here for the alpha and post, both for eyes open and eyes closed. Right? In the pre, there's a lot of red, so particularly, and that red diminishes as we look at the post. And here are some other bands, just real quick. You can see that you get the same kind of data for all of the bands, and eyes open, eyes closed.
Well, I know as a client, when I was doing my own neurofeedback training, it was really fun to see brain maps and see how things had progressed. So I think that people are going to be really excited about this and really appreciate what you guys are working on there in MindLift.
Yeah, so we're also quite excited, and just waiting till we're all confident to release it. But yeah, and we are keen to receive feedback. So, if you guys out there are using this and you have comments, whether they be positive or otherwise, let us know. This is the time. This is the time for us to tweak it and improve it and make it the best it can possibly be. So, yeah.
Well, Glenn, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. I know the audience will appreciate it too. And good luck with the release.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.